I'm Hans Kalit for Precision Aerobatics, and this is PA Builds. In this video, we'll cover the final 3 steps required to complete your model's assembly. Now these are radio setup, propeller balancing, and finally the balancing or CGing of the model itself. Before we begin, however, we recommend for safety that you leave the propeller off of the model until the final step of CGing the airplane. We begin with radio setup. Properly setting up your plane with a radio is a critical step, and it's not one that should be done hurriedly, as an improperly set up airplane will be difficult to fly. For all of the PA models, you'll need a modern computerized radio. Beyond that, the brand is your choice. But you must also select a full-range receiver and avoid installing any clone-type receivers or ones intended for smaller foamies or park flyers. And finally, do not wire harness your aileron servos together into a single channel. For a properly set up model, you must have each surface connected to an independent channel on the receiver. So you'll need at least a 5-channel receiver. Radio manufacturers often have varying names for their menus or their setup features. But what's important is that the basic principles be followed on your radio to ensure a successful setup. One final note is that these setup instructions do not take into consideration the installation and usage of receivers with built-in gyros. You'll need to consult the manual included with your gyro for help here. We begin with a new model, and after setting the name, we set the wing type. The correct wing type is dual aileron and a normal tail. You could also run flaperons in an advanced setup. Step 2, rate setup. Start by assigning the switch locations for dual rates, or alternatively flight modes or flight conditions. This is a matter of personal preference, but you'll want a minimum of 2 active rates, one for low and one for high. My personal choice is to run 4 flight modes across the top 2 switches with a precision or low rate, a snap rate, a tumbling rate, and a general 3D rate, all easily available to me. Now it's important to leave your newly switched rates at their default 100% values for the time being. We'll revisit these settings later, but in order to obtain maximum consistency and servo resolution, these values must be at 100% for steps 3 and 4 of the setup. Step 3, subtrim. It's important to understand first how subtrim works. Subtrim allows for the adjustment of the servo's neutral position. And in most radio systems, adjusting subtrim will effectively shorten the travel range of the servo in one direction and increase it in the other. So ideally, we want to keep these numbers to a minimum. A 0 value, however, may not always be possible because of the spline locations on the servo's output shaft. If your subtrim numbers are higher than 30, say, it's worth verifying that the arm is at its absolute best location. And if you're using high-tech digital programmable servos, this isn't as important, as the endpoints and center points can all be reprogrammed later. Now during the build, I emphasized how important it was to get the linkage geometry properly built with the servo arms at 90 degrees to the servo case, while the flight surfaces were centered. And here is where all that effort pays off. If you've done it properly, you'll either require no adjustment or very little in order to recenter the surfaces again, thereby centering the servo arms to that very important 90-degree position. Step 4, travel or endpoint adjustment. The goal of this step is to obtain equal flight surface deflection in both directions. This will keep your model feeling more consistent on the sticks. Now we'll be measuring and setting maximum surface deflection, the throws, and you can use any number of devices or methods to measure the deflection of your surfaces, but the simplest is to use the handy laser cut angle gauge that was included in your PA kit. Now from your radio, select the surface to be adjusted, and then hold the corresponding stick at full deflection to either stop. Slowly increase the values until the servo binds or no longer moves, and then back it off a few clicks to relieve the strain. Or you can also stop when the surface reaches a recommended angle for the highest rates as listed in the manual. Do exactly the same for the opposite direction and match both sides of travel so they're equal. In the case of the ailerons, it's very important that all 4 angles be the same at full deflection, unless your manual or personal preferences call for differential, as is the case of the Ultimate AMR, and this can easily be programmed in now or later to your radio. Now for the rudder, make sure that the tail surfaces are not touching, as they may bind in the air under the load. There must be a gap. Step 5. Door rates and exponential. Go back to the same rate page or menu as in Step 2. Now switch to the rates and follow the manual, making adjustments to the numbers to obtain the recommended throws for low rates, high rates, and whatever else you've chosen. You'll again have to measure how the changing numbers alter the angle, but since the surfaces were matched in Step 4, you need only do this to one side, as they should be equal. Avoid increasing the rate values on this screen above 100% though, as you'll lose resolution and could overdrive your servo. Exponential reduces or softens the sensitivity near the stick center. And again, this is a matter of personal preference. The provided starting points are only a suggestion. Step 6. Throttle cut. Now I think this step is extremely important, and it's also very underutilized. Chances are good that if you have a current radio, there's a dedicated screen just for throttle cut. This feature acts as a switchable safety on the throttle stick, and I suggest you turn it on anytime you aren't holding the radio in your hands in the act of flying the plane, which includes the ground operations prior to takeoff. Balancing your propeller. PA suggests the use of high-quality wood props made by Vox. Vox props are incredibly consistent, with many of them not requiring any adjustment from the factory. But the balance should be checked on each prop you own regardless. Out-of-balance props create vibrations that wear out every part of the model prematurely. Here I'm using a Dubro 499 true spin balancer. We begin by clamping our prop in and balancing the blades by putting them at 3 and 9 o'clock. Steady it and release. The heavy blade will drop to the bottom. We have a few options when it comes to balancing our propellers. We can either take material away from the heavier, the low side, or add material and weight to the high side, the lighter blade. The best method would be to use a clear coat spray. Because this is an airfoil, it's best, if you can, to keep the surface finish consistent on all sides of the blade. You just take some clear coat and lightly apply it to the lighter side to add weight to that blade. If you find you have a propeller that needs a little bit more aggressive approach, try a light sanding or scuffing, a little at a time from the heavier blade. And again, ideally, if you clear coat it when you're done, you're giving your airfoil the best overall efficiency. Now, the blades are balanced when they do remain at 3 and 9 o'clock. We then move on to positioning the blades at 6 and 12 o'clock. This is to balance the hub. Same principles apply. The heavy side will be the low point. Sanding the hub is acceptable again, but should it seem to get excessive, I suggest you go on to adding weight to the other side. Your blade is perfectly balanced when it will remain stationary in any position. You can now mount the prop on the model. The PA prop adapter uses a 10mm nut. If you're having trouble with this adapter spinning on the shaft, first wipe down the contact areas with alcohol and then mount the adapter and prop without the back plate. Tighten it down to set the adapter, then remove and reinstall as normal. If it's still slipping after being wiped down, you can try to roughen up the shaft a little with some fine sandpaper or a needle file. Snug the nut down to just before it crushes the wood fibers, and be sure to check it after the first flights, as it may need to be tightened a bit more after it's taken a set. Balancing your airplane. You've reached the final step in the assembly and setup of your PA model, and it's time to balance or CG the aircraft. This is a critical step you have to take to ensure a safe and predictable maiden flight. PA planes are renowned for the duality of their aerobatic abilities and their docile slow speed and easy landing characteristics. But all bets are off if you have an airplane that's outside of its CG limits. Be sure to do this one inside and not at the field. It's just far too important. If you've chosen the IPA's power system and built the plane using the methods in this video guide, the battery tray will provide ample adjustment room. The method of fingertip balancing just is not accurate or consistent enough for models this light. We absolutely recommend the use of a balancer such as this one from Multiplex, or any of the other ones available such as the Great Plains CG machine. For models such as the Ultimate AMR, you may have to make your own CG rig as described in the manual, and there are also plans online for a homemade CG sling called the Vanessa CG machine. And though it's not a machine, it's actually very good, and these devices can usually be cobbled together in a hobbyist workshop from scrap lying around, and they're still far more accurate than the fingertips method. Begin by consulting your manual for the recommended CG. This is measured from the back of the leading edge of the wing. The model must be completely set up and ready for flight before you attempt to balance it. Adjust your measures and place the plane on the CG rig in the upright position. The horizontal stab is your reference for level. Make adjustments with the batteries fore and aft until the plane rests completely unassisted with the tail level to the ground. If you feel that you need ballast weights to balance the plane, I urge you to take a closer look at the placement of your radio system, ESC, batteries, rudder servo, or anything that could possibly be relocated without adding unnecessary weight to the airframe. Thanks for watching this PA Builds video series. We hope you enjoy your PA model as much as we do. Happy flying!